guys, in this video we will be discussing the end of World War I. We are going to be describing the major effects of World War I. We will be identifying major characteristics of World War I. We will be explaining the impact of Wilson's 14 points and the Treaty of Versailles, and we will be explaining the significance of the League of Nations and identifying examples of politically motivated mass murders in Armenia. By the time that we are finished, you will evaluate the effects of World War I. Okay, so we'll start with the events that led up to the end of World War I. On November 3rd of 1918, German sailors refused to sail out. They did not feel that there was any use in fighting anymore. They were exhausted. On November 9th of 1918, the German Kaiser, also known as the Emperor, is overthrown. There was no decisive battle that ended the war, but the German war machine could no longer continue to fight. So on November 11th at 11 a.m., also known as Armistice Day, all the fighting stopped. An armistice is an agreement to stop fighting, a truce, in other words, and so everybody put down their guns and went home. Leading up to the war, President Wilson had been discussing his plan for post-World War I Europe. He wanted to develop a treaty that would deliver a just peace, something that was fair and would prevent future wars from breaking out again. This idea of Wilson's is very important in World War I because it encourages Germany to surrender. There are only 4 of Wilson's ideas that actually make it onto the treaty, but his promotion of this fair peace encouraged the Germans to surrender. Here's a list of President Wilson's 14 points. He wanted open diplomacy, no more secret treaties, no more secret alliances between countries. Everything should be out in the open, and people should try to work out their grievances without resorting to violence. He also wanted freedom of the seas. One of the biggest problems in World War I, leading up to World War I, was the fight for trading access in other countries, and so by allowing countries to travel the seas freely, that would eliminate those tensions. He wanted to remove economic barriers for trade. He wanted to reduce the amount of weapons that and armies that countries possessed. Remember that militarism and building up the military led up to a lot of tensions that started World War I, so he wanted to reduce that. He wanted to adjust colonial claims to make the colonies more evenly distributed. He wanted to settle these conquered territories that in Russia that were rebelling against foreign rule. He wanted to preserve Belgium as a independent country. He wanted to restore the territory that the French had lost to Germans in previous conflicts. He wanted to redraw the boundaries for Italy. He also suggested that Austria-Hungary be divided and those ethnic groups get their own countries. He wanted to redraw all those Balkan boundaries so that everybody got an independent nation. He wanted to put limits on the Turkish Empire and establish an independent Poland. And he also wanted to create an association of nations that would come together to work out disputes and try to prevent future wars. These 4 points here are the only ones that actually made it to the final treaty. So, a Paris Peace Conference was held where all of the countries involved in the war, the major countries, would come together to determine the terms of the peace. The Treaty of Versailles was one of the treaties, and this one particularly dealt with Germany. It was not ratified by the United States despite President Wilson's involvement in creating some of the terms in the treaty. The Senate did not agree to these conditions and did not sign it. So some of the peace terms on this treaty really hurt Germany. Their military was reduced to a small police force. They also lost a lot of land to Poland, Belgium, France, Denmark, and Czechoslovakia, and the Germans also lost their colonies overseas. And probably the most damaging of the terms of this treaty was the war guilt clause. Germany was forced to accept all of the responsibility for the war, and as a result, they had to pay very high reparations. Reparations are fines penalties for the damage that they caused in the war. In order to prevent future wars, a League of Nations was created. This is an organization of countries similar to the United Nations that we have today. And their goal is to provide a venue for countries to work out their disputes without having to go to war. The League was very ineffective. It was weak for several reasons. It did not have the authority to impose sanctions. So if countries didn't abide by the rules, there was nothing they could do to penalize them. They also had no military force. It had to rely on other countries to provide soldiers if they wanted to use the military for any reason. Also, all of the decisions made had to be unanimously approved by the council, which was certain countries who were selected as the leaders of the League of Nations, and often they disagreed. And the US and Russia did not join the League of Nations, and they were two of the most powerful countries in the world. The United States in particular was very influential after World War I, but they did not join the League of Nations, making it that much weaker. Here is a political cartoon that perfectly explains how the League of Nations was not powerful enough to do anything in Europe. The men here represent different countries of Europe. This here would be Stalin. He becomes the leader of Russia, and he's off in the east doing his thing. Nobody's aware of what he's doing. These countries here are the Germans, the Italians. This one would be the French. They're trying to stop the bullies or the aggressors from causing any damage, but they're not very successful. And the League of Nations is represented as a woman. In the cartoon, she's a lot smaller. She's making a lot of noise, but she's not as powerful as the other countries and has no power to stop them from doing whatever they want to do. So during World War I, we didn't really talk about the Middle East, but the Middle East was impacted by this war as well. The Ottoman Empire, which, if you remember from previous units, the Ottoman Empire had replaced the Byzantine Empire, which was the Eastern Roman Empire. This area is home to a lot of Armenian Christians. Some of these Armenian Christians were very vocal about their desire to be independent, and Ottomans feared that they were going to be sympathetic to the Russians because Russians also were Christian. So in 1915, the Ottoman government began what is known as the Armenian Genocide or the Armenian Massacre. Millions of Armenians were sent on death marches to the Syrian desert. A lot of them were killed by firing squads. They were burned alive. They were drowned, poisoned, or even hung by the government. And this was in an effort to exterminate all of the Armenian Christians who were living in the Ottoman Empire. Over in Asia Minor, the Allied powers took control of a lot of the Turkish territory in Arabia, Syria, and Palestine. General Mustafa Kemal, or also known as Ataturk, he led a resistance against the Allied powers, and he succeeded, so Turkey became an independent nation. In Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, the Allies actually promised independence to the Arabians if they joined them in their war effort, and they took back that promise. When the war was over, they divided Arabia into colonies between France and Great Britain, and so they walked back on that promise, and that led to a lot of ethnic conflicts in the region. So let's look at the overall effects of World War I. There was a political impact, of course. This war marks the end of many monarchies in Europe. Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire will see all of their monarchs removed from power. This instability leads to a rise of dictators, which we will cover more when we get to World War II. A lot of new countries are created at the end of World War I. Countries like Czechoslovakia, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, Yugoslavia, Syria, and Iraq. They're fairly new countries, and new countries usually experience a lot of instability. This change also leads to ethnic conflicts in those regions. There's an economic impact. Europe's infrastructure is almost completely destroyed. Lots of farmlands, railroads, and buildings are completely demolished, and Europe has to rebuild all of this destruction in order to get their economy back on track. The German economy is especially harmed by the end of World War I because they have such high reparations to pay. This means that they're going to go bankrupt. Germany is going to see a high rate of unemployment together with their currency that is practically worthless, and this leads to depression in Germany. All of Europe experiences a depression. It also reaches the United States in the 1930s, but basically depression is a very bad economic recession where you have high unemployment and high prices. Here are some images of the destruction that World War I left in Europe. As you can see, cities were completely destroyed. It's going to cost a lot of money to rebuild all of this. Railroads are uprooted, so this is going to impact trade. And a lot of families are displaced, and children are left homeless and orphaned. So here are the consequences for society. Population declined exponentially. There are 10 million men who are killed in the war. Millions more are wounded and disabled. We see 5 million widows. Those are women whose husbands die in the war. 9 million children are orphaned, and there's also a lot of displaced refugees, people who don't have a home. There's a psychological damage too. Survivors of the war suffer from shell shock, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. They come home without limbs, or they experience the death of friends or family. There's an increase in alcoholism and addiction to morphine. And there's also an increase in depression and suicide. Veterans struggle to find work and a place in society. So there's a huge psychological impact on society at the end of World War I. Here are some images of a widow with her children, mass graves, and the destruction in the cities. People who came back from the war, victims of mustard gas or shrapnel, had deformities like this one. A lot of amputees, and a lot of orphans who were taken in by orphanages. Alright, that brings us to the end of the lesson and journal entry number 32. So I want you to answer this question. In your opinion, what was the most devastating effect of World War I? Which of those effects do you think is the worst? Support your answer with specific examples. If you have any questions, bring them to class, and thank you for watching.